Good afternoon, everyone. I am Nina Woodward, Director of Chase Emerson Memorial Library located in Deer Isle, Maine, and I'm so pleased you are all able to join us today to learn more about our state's history and spend time with Dr. Riordan as he presents past and present perspectives on the Maine Bicentennial, a view from Deer Isle. Here's a little bit about today's speaker. Dr. Riordan received his undergraduate Bachelor of Arts at the University of California, Berkeley, and his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania. He has been a faculty member in the Department of History at the University of Maine in Orono since 1997. He's a specialist on the American Revolution and has published about religious, racial, and ethnic diversity in the Philadelphia region from 1770 to 1830, and the history of Loyalists. Liam currently serves on the City of Bangor's Commission on Cultural Development. He is the past director of the University of Maine Humanities Center and is a past board member of the Maine Humanities Council. He helps to organize Maine National History Day, a statewide history contest for middle and high school students. Liam's wife is a chair of the English department at Bangor High School, and they have 2 sons. His family lived in Scotland in 2012 when he was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Glasgow. With thanks to the Maine Humanities Council for their sponsorship of this event, I am delighted to present to you Dr. Liam Riordan.
That everyone sees a large PowerPoint screen and just a very small image of me in the corner. And I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you today. Nina Woodward has been terrific to work with in getting this set up. I also appreciate the support of the Maine Humanities Council, whose financial assistance makes the event possible. And of course, most of all, I really appreciate that all of you have attended on this sweltering Maine August day. So thank you for Zooming in. We've got a Q&A box set up, so you should see that as a button on most of you on the bottom of your screen or possibly on the top of your screen. And I welcome questions at any time. If something comes up while I am droning on and you'd like something clarified, please type it in and I will hopefully notice it and respond to it. And I also will have time for discussion at the end of the talk as well. So because this is set up as a webinar, though, it's sort of just my voice and Nina's voice going out, and we can interact with you through that Q&A box at the bottom. So let's see, I have a funny button pop up. Great, so I think we'll get started. I see a little chat. So James is helping me out here. He says, I seem to be sharing my entire screen rather than just the presentation box. Right. I am not entirely sure how to fix that, James. Thank you. What I'll try to do is just make that Q&A box a little bit smaller. That's where I can also see where we get questions, although perhaps those come in via the chat, which I just got from you. So if someone wants to test the Q&A box, we could see if I need that window open at all. Maybe I can just use the chat and only open it when it gets flagged. All right, well, I'm gonna plunge in and hopefully we've got the screen set up in such a way that you can see most of what, there's James is now on Q&A. May need to stop sharing and then share just the presentation. Well, I'm happy to stop sharing. And you're suggesting that when I share screen, I just share the Microsoft. I'll try doing that. So my screen looks the same, but maybe it's different going out now, James. Does that look a little cleaner to you? Let's see. Great. All right. Thank you for that technical help. I really appreciate it. So I am an early American historian at the University of Maine. My specialty is really sort of the broad Revolutionary era. And several years ago, I sort of saw that the bicentennial of the state was coming up. And although I had never really thought of myself as a historian of Maine or really even a historian of New England, this important development for the state was within the time period that I specialized in. So I started doing some research about the statehood era, which for me stretches from the 1780s to the 1820s. It was a very long movement that had a lot of ups and downs, and that's part of what I want to talk about with you today. But really, before turning to the historical matter, the historical subject itself, I think it's also worthwhile to start with a broader question about how we commemorate the past and what sort of significance a 200-year marker like a bicentennial possesses. And, one thing that I obviously really appreciate about it is that it does raise public awareness about early American history. I've been a professor at the University of Maine since 1997, but by and large, it's only with the coincidence of the bicentennial that there's a sort of broader interest in developments of the late 18th and early 19th century. So maybe that's a little bit self-serving, but that's something that I really appreciate about a bicentennial and the opportunity it provides to commemorate the distant past. And this broader question of historical commemoration is why I start with the image that you've been looking at for a while now. This, as most of you probably know, is the commemorative license plate that the state of Maine has set up, where you can send the Secretary of State a small check and get this attractive plate for the front of your car and take off that boring old front plate. And you can do it all through the year of 2020, and I'm hoping they'll extend it into 2021 as a lot of bicentennial issues have been pushed into 2021 for obvious reasons. But, in the end, that sort of commemorative license plate is, a somewhat limited or superficial way to commemorate the past. It doesn't really help us think about the past any differently. And I think that's really an important question. What is our goal when we participate in historical commemoration? How do we and how should we remember the relatively distant past? Obviously, this has become a really controversial question recently around Confederate monuments and other types of public memorials. And I do, really believe that history has a more important purpose to play in American society. That obviously history can entertain, it can inform, it can instruct, but really at its very best, historical understanding can help us to grasp deeper meanings about our own society, our own culture, and really even our own sense of self. It helps us to expand our gaze outward from the individual and the personal to think a bit about something broader that we share. And so ultimately, I am really interested in how the past and the present relate to one another. Right? There are certain things that changed dramatically over time, but there are other aspects of even the distant past and the bicentennial that we can recognize as being surprisingly familiar. So this is really the meaning of my title, to try to explore both past and present perspectives on the Maine statehood era, and to include just a little bit of information about Deer Isle toward the end of my talk. But I'm really hoping that there are some local history buffs on this Zoom event and some genealogists, and that they'll be able to contribute to my growing sense of Maine history with a clearer understanding of distinctive elements of Deer Isle and how the people there participated in the statehood movement from 200 years ago. So I hope we return to this broad question of, what do we want history to do to us at the very end of my talk? And again, I welcome questions via the Q&A or via the chat as I'm going along, or at the end when I'll take a break and sort of rest my voice. So rather than continue with the sort of enormously challenging question of what's the meaning of historical commemoration, I think it's helpful to start with just the most basic fact about Maine statehood. So Maine became the 23rd state in the US on March 15th, 1820. We have a very specific birthday for the state. And of course, that date of 1820 is why we have the 2020 Bicentennial. So Maine became the 23rd state in 1820, and this ended a very long relationship with Massachusetts. Since the 1650s, the down east part of Massachusetts, or the District of Maine, as it was called sort of officially in the early national period, was part of Massachusetts. So this is a very old and long-standing relationship, and so changing it and separating from Massachusetts was a much more challenging thing for people at the time than we might think it would have been or should have been from our perspective today. And so I pair that just basic date and fact about Maine statehood with this terrific map by Moses Greenleaf, and we're going to look at another map by him a little bit later in the talk. He was really terrific surveyor and map maker and sort of Renaissance man who lived in this era. And I think of this as the sort of first official map of the state of Maine. He makes it in 1820. He titles it A Map of the State of Maine. And I particularly call your attention to the fact that this image, the map itself, is at the Osher Map Library, which is part of the University of Southern Maine. They have a terrific public mission. A lot of their material is available digitally. So if you are a map fanatic or a history fanatic, that is a great website to check out. And I encourage you to explore it. They have, of course, an excellent collection of Maine maps, but all kinds of really world-class treasures, Renaissance era maps and maps of all shapes and sizes. So a great resource to take advantage of in Maine. So that broad question again that I've posed is, can the past of 1820 and the present of 2020 speak to one another? Right? What are the connections and what are the places where we find striking differences between the two? And, I think we can ask the very basic question, do we have any meaningful connection to such a long time ago? I mean, what do we literally share with people who lived in Maine 200 years ago? And I do always want to keep in mind, even though I'm going to be pursuing some of these connections, it's also important to recognize that there are really significant differences. And that ultimately is what I find really compelling about history, is how do we weigh that balance between past and present, between change and persistence. And I think the statehood era and the bicentennial of the state gives us a great test subject for exploring that issue. So this has taken me through my prefatory comments, and I'm going to take a look at my timer in the hopes of not wearing out my welcome with you. Basically, the talk is organized into exploring 4 present-day connections to the statehood era. And again, I sort of think of that as more than just the single year of 1820, but really the first calls for statehood began in the 1780s. There are many of them and 6 public votes, and only is the separation movement successful with popular support in a vote of 1819, and then the accomplishment of statehood itself in 1820. So let me start with and I will also say I do not give equal time in my talk to all 4 of these developments. So the first one, I'm going to speak about at a little bit greater length, but don't worry, I am pressing to sort of wrap up my comments in about another half hour, and then be able to turn to your questions and comments via chat or typed Q&A. So let's start with the most famous dimension of Maine statehood. And this is the one that most people are familiar with, but it's a complicated political issue that can be a bit confusing even to historians specializing in this period. And that is the issue of how do slavery and the state of Maine get connected as part of Maine's process of breaking apart from Massachusetts and becoming an independent state in the US, right? This is a little bit confusing. There are no enslaved people of African descent living in Maine in 1820, and there are relatively few free people of African descent living in Maine in that year. Yet Maine was absolutely central to the first nationwide crisis about slavery and racial politics that really rocked the American national political scene for several years from 1819 into the early 1820s. So to help us think about this, I've got an image that is a classic one. Almost every single US textbook has some version of this map that shows Maine entering as a free state in the top right-hand corner of the map, and Missouri entering as a slave state in the center of the map. And this was a really complicated set of bills that were passed by the US Congress. And in addition to admitting them as sort of balancing one another, another provision was the establishment of this 3630 line that we see in red. And this committed the nation to admitting Missouri as a slave state, but that no other future territory north of that line would be permitted to enter the US as a state where slavery was legal. Now, there are some, I think, very basic aspects of this map that are misleading and perhaps even wrong. And the first one of them was raised by a member of the audience in one of my very first public talks about the Bicentennial that was 3 or 4 years ago. And she was really annoyed that when she learned about this event in school, it was called the Maine-Missouri Compromise. So she was saying, you know, why is this titled Missouri Compromise? That's not accurate. It involves something more than that, and Maine in particular. And I think that's a fair criticism. But I think the second shortcoming in this image concerns the word compromise. And to explain why I think the word compromise is not really important, we have to dig a bit deeper into how Maine's statehood became a national controversy. So part of the final steps of statehood was that a petition was submitted to the 16th US Congress in December of 1819, asking that Maine be admitted as a new state separate from Massachusetts. And to understand what unfolds, we need to, I think, at least have 2 sort of basic facts about the politics of this era. One is that the most important political leader of the statehood movement in its final decade or two was William King. William King will become the first governor of the independent state of Maine, and he was a very wealthy merchant based in Bath. And he had served in the Massachusetts legislature for a number of years, but he had never been elected to national office, nor did he ever run for national office, which I think is kind of interesting. It actually says something to us about state politics being much more important than national politics in this period of the early republic, right? He preferred to be a mover and shaker at the state level rather than to run to be in Congress or the Senate of the United States. Now, the second basic fact about the politics of this time is to note that the District of Maine, and again, I'm just talking about the District of Maine, right? Not even as a separate state at this point, but based on population, the District of Maine in 1819 and 1820 had 7 members in the US House of Representatives. That's a pretty interesting disconnection between past and present, right? We only have 2 congresspeople from Maine today, yet in the period that we're talking about, the District of Maine had 7 representatives in the House of Representatives. All right, so back to the narrative. This petition arrives in Washington, D.C., requesting admission as statehood, but then something surprising happens right away. And one of the congressmen from Maine, a guy named Mark Langdon Hill, who was from Phippsburg, wrote back to William King from DC to warn him that there was trouble coming. So in December of 1819, Hill writes from DC, warning that, quote, some bargain or compromise will be needed. And then Hill further pointed out that all the Maine members of Congress would need to act prudently, and they would, quote, need to say nothing opposed to the wishes of the Southern people. And then, as if this isn't clear enough what he's getting at, he adds a PS to this letter, and he says, I hope the people of Maine will remain still on the slave question. So why did this come up? Why immediately is this posing such a challenge to advocates of Maine statehood like Mark Hill or like William King? Well, the background is that the US Congress and US national politics more generally had been deadlocked since February of that year, 1819, over the admission of Missouri as a new slave state. So Missouri is going to become a state a year after Maine, but their petition to become a state has actually gotten to the Congress about a year in advance of Maine's. And the US House of Representatives passed a bill to prohibit Missouri's admission as a slave state, but the US Senate did not support that bill. So there's an important long-term continuity. We've got complete deadlock in the national politics of the US, and Maine is getting embroiled in that as it submits its petition to become independent. Now, this is a key moment, right, as Hill is writing back to William King, explaining the situation there, asking for advice, trying to figure out what the best way forward is. And William King is in an extremely interesting position. He grew up in Scarborough, Maine, with a stepbrother named Rufus King. And Rufus, at this time, was a leading anti-slavery member of the US Senate representing New York. So we might think that William would take a cue from his brother and write back to Hill and say, you know, no, we shouldn't be silent on the slavery issue. We should do what my brother is doing in the US Senate and say that Maine does not have slave interests itself, and we don't want to be part of whatever might be getting cooked up with Missouri. Unfortunately, from our point of view today, William King did not follow his brother's lead. He wavers a little bit, but very quickly he agrees with Hill and another of the key US congressmen, John Holmes from Alfred, Maine, and they're really pushing hard for getting Maine statehood done, right? This is sort of their position as absolute advocates of Maine statehood, regardless of the kinds of negotiations that might involve Missouri on this issue. And again, this is just followed intensely in the press of the day. Here is a commentary from the Eastern Argus, the major Portland newspaper, who had a reporter in DC, and it published on January 25th, 1820, quote, "The debate on the Missouri question has at length commenced in the Senate and absorbs so much attention that until it is indefinitely settled, it may almost be said that no other business will be done in Congress. Never were the galleries and lobbies more crowded." Right? So this is got the spotlight in an era, without C-SPAN, without instant communication, but it really has riveted the attention of the US, and it really is leading to a lot of tension and pressure about trying to resolve this issue in the US Congress. What emerges is a really complicated set of negotiations over multiple bills that are managed by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. Clay represents Kentucky, a slave state with some very similar issues with Missouri. So he, has a lot of interest riding on a successful admission of Missouri as a slave state. And the key vote that comes up that refused to restrict slavery in Missouri, and remember, that's already passed the US House, but it's back before the US House. They vote on it again in the context of this sausage making regarding Maine and Missouri. And this time, the question passes that the federal government will not block the admission of Missouri as a state with slavery, and it passes by the narrowest of margins, just 90 to 87, this squeaks by. Now, what is most fascinating of all is how the 7 representatives in the US Congress from the District of Maine voted on this bill. 5 of them voted against it, right? They were on the losing side in that very narrow vote, but for them, it was more important to take an anti-slavery stand than it was to secure Maine's statehood at any cost. And what is so crucial about this is that that minority in the District of Maine who favored the admission of Missouri as a slave state, if those 2 had voted with the majority in the District of Maine, it would have been enough to block it in the US House of Representatives. So potentially an enormously different outcome to this crucial issue. Now, one thing that's really helpful to historians is that when politicians are forced to take really difficult stands on issues of great public interest, they end up explaining why they took the stands that they did. And so the 2 major papers in Maine at this time published the letters, the sort of public letters from the representatives explaining why they took the stand that they did. So on the left of the screen, this address to the people of Maine was written by 4 of the 5 who opposed the bargain between Maine and Missouri. And they explained that they took that stand because of their fear of slave power, that they thought it would corrupt Republican government. And they used this, just very strong language that it was abhorrent to their notions of the rights of man and humanity to permit slavery to expand in this way. And then they go on in this letter in the Portland Gazette to say it is a falsehood to call this a compromise. We utterly protested against and refused to sanction it with our approbation. So there is my second problem with this textbook. Compromise is actually a pretty loaded term that implies a value judgment about a positive negotiated settlement. And here we have these people saying it is not something that the majority of the congressional delegation from Maine agreed with. And so one of the past-present connections that we can see between 2020 and 1820 is that politics has long been fueled by anger and hostility. And our current election cycle is, I would say, less hostile, if you can imagine it, than the politics of this era that were brutal and intensely negative. And I think some of that comes across in the language of those men. The other letter on the right, the person, one of the two who voted in favor of this, John Holmes, he actually sends a copy of this letter to the leader of the Democratic Republican Party that Holmes is a part of, Thomas Jefferson, still alive in Monticello. And it's really a response to Holmes's letter where Jefferson pens his really famous language about the Missouri Compromise, which I'd be happy to discuss in the Q&A time, but if I talk about it now, I'll never get through my lecture. So my final thoughts about this opening past-present connection are really to stress a more profound one than simply the persistence of partisan hostility in American political life. And that is that it really calls us to recognize the importance of Blackness in American political culture. Even in a state like Maine that did not have a large population of people of African descent, neither in the statehood era nor today, it is such a central legacy of slavery in American society that it cannot be avoided if we're really going to engage national political culture. So let me move on to my next of the past-present connections. And this is to ask, what did Maine statehood mean for Wabanaki sovereignty? When we're discussing state formation in North America, surely one crucial context concerns the Native American presence and the persistence of Native societies and governments in the face of colonization. So this image from the Portland Press Herald ran an article in December 2014, I think nicely shows how the colonial presence across northeastern North America from New England into the Canadian Maritimes are entangled with a wide range of Native American land claims. And they have been an active presence throughout Wabanaki, this Wabanaki territory, from the pre-colonial era up to the present. Now, what does this mean in a historical sense, and how was Wabanaki's sovereignty related to Maine's statehood? And in exploring this issue, I think we need to balance two somewhat contrasting dimensions of the issue. We need to be aware of perils and real fundamental challenges to Wabanaki sovereignty that arise and intensify with the statehood movement, and at the same time acknowledge the long persistence of Wabanaki people in this region. So let me start with the perils and acknowledge that the statehood era of the late 18th and early 19th century was a time of rapid Wabanaki dispossession from the land, right? This marks an intensification of colonization that is driven particularly by the booming population of Euro-Americans in Maine generally, but especially in Maine, east of the Penobscot River, that has been very lightly settled by Europeans prior to the American Revolution. Another aspect of marking the perils of Wabanaki relationship to Maine as a state can be traced in a history of Indian voting rights in Maine. So federal law granted Native Americans the right to vote in 1924, but that federal law only pertained to national elections. So Native Americans were not recognized as voters by Maine state law until a constitutional amendment was passed in 1954. So Maine is the second to last state in the US to grant the right to vote to Native Americans. And this, I think, is really a profound marker of some of the perils that statehood would bring to Wabanaki people, a decline in their position and rights and status. Now, there is also really important to recognize the persistence of Wabanaki people and their presence in Maine politics is a sort of remarkable story, that there were Penobscot tribal delegates to the Maine legislature starting in 1823. So essentially, immediately after Maine becomes a state, there are formally recognized tribal delegates from the Penobscot Nation who are attending the legislative meetings of the state of Maine. The Passamaquoddies would join in 1842, and then the Holton Band of Maliseets would in 2010. And I think that Maine is the only state in the country to have tribal representatives in its state legislature. And this is part of the unique and evolving Wabanaki-Maine relationship that continues today, and in fact is in the newspapers just this week as this question of Wabanaki sovereignty is hopefully being addressed by legislative discussions. Now, it is important to note that those tribal delegates were not voting members of the legislature. It was not a equitable or fair sort of situation. But when we look at other state legislatures across the US, when we look at the persistence of the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy in particular, maintaining some portion of their pre-colonial traditional homeland in a way that is unbroken and recognized by colonial authorities to the present, that is really remarkable. I think they are two of the only groups in the US east of the Mississippi River that have been able to hold on to some portion of their traditional homeland. Now, of course, it is incredibly reduced from what it was before the colonial era began. And again, the land controlled by Wabanaki groups is going to particularly decline as part of the statehood era. All right, let me move on to my third point and take a quick look at my timer to see how I'm doing. Not too bad. The third issue that I think brings up some fascinating connections between the past and the present concerns regional diversity in the state of Maine generally, and in particular, the meaning of the international border. And I want to start this by quoting from a very curious footnote in the 1820 census. This is the printed copy of the census that the federal government prints and distributes widely, right? Really essential, as we well know in 2020, to figuring out the distribution of representatives in the US Congress. And Penobscot County had just been formed in 1818, so just prior to the census and to Maine statehood. And in 1820, there are the 43 towns in the whole county, and the largest three are Hamden with 1,400 people, Bangor with 1,200 people, and the third largest was Madawaska with 1,100 people. And after the entry for Madawaska, there's a little asterisk. And if you look at the bottom of that page, I think it's page 25 of the 1820 printed census, there's this explanation of what Madawaska is. Quote, "The French settlement near Canada, about 200 miles from any town in Maine, from which there is no way to Madawaska. This town is only accessible via New Brunswick in, quote, a way very circuitous up the River St. John. The French have supposed they were in Canada. It is probable the county line, when run, will divide Madawaska between Penobscot and Washington counties." Now, there are a couple of things that I think are really fascinating about this commentary by the census taker. One of them is just this sort of classic Maine joke, right? You can't get there from here, right? There is no way to Madawaska from the rest of Maine. You can only really get there by going to St. John, New Brunswick, and then having this circuitous route up the St. John River. But of course, more profoundly is this line about it being likely that the town of Madawaska, which then on, French-speaking settlements on both sides of the St. John River, well, it'll probably end up being divided between Penobscot and Washington counties. Now, that international border will, of course, not be settled until the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. So in many ways, the statehood era really is unresolved until we actually know what were the boundaries of the state of Maine. And I think that is communicated to us by the map we're looking at, another terrific map from the Osher Map Library. This was the most detailed map of Eastern North America made in the 18th century. And by 1775, it was out in a 4th edition. It's a huge map. It's maybe 12 feet by 10 feet in size. So really great. Once got to look at it all folded out on a huge table at the Osher Map Library. And all these lines on the map show different interpretations at the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution about what the boundary should be between British North America and the new United States. As you can see, there is some huge variation of opinion about where that line should be drawn. So there's language in the treaty, but those words bear no clear correspondence to actual topographic sites on the land. And this is the dilemma of people living in Madawaska, certainly in 1820, and it will intensify in 1842 when the international border ends up dividing the French-speaking community of Madawaska into two distinct nations. And that is really a sundering of French-speaking culture in the St. John Valley that is still very strongly felt today. So, and I really got a sense of this. I gave a bicentennial talk in Madawaska, I forget now, 2 or 3 years ago. And the sense of isolation and being apart from what went on in a sort of Augusta-centered politics of the state of Maine was really tangibly felt. And not just in a political sense. It's really, several people said to me, and they thanked me for coming up and giving the talk, and they explained that it was really hard from people in southern Maine, like Bangor. So that was pretty funny, right? People in Bangor don't really think of themselves as living in southern Maine. And then they went on to say, it's hard for people in southern Maine to come to Madawaska because you have to drive uphill all the way. It's much easier for us to go to southern Maine because we can coast. It's all downhill. So this awareness of regional diversity in the state of Maine that is contemporary as well as historical is, I think, a really crucial point to remember as we sometimes slip in to thinking about Maine as fundamentally divided into two basic differences, right? This whole question of the two Maines really violates a much more variegated and much more interesting Maine society and culture than a simple two Maines allows. And that's a theme I want to continue on as I turn to my fourth and final of my topics, and then we'll turn to some discussion. I hope you're curious and have some questions for me or comments to add. So I've already alluded to the fact of intense strife in the politics of this era. This is absolutely true of the Maine statehood issue. It was complicated, it was hard fought, people really disagreed strongly about it. And oftentimes the statehood movement is described as a fundamentally bipolar movement, that more coastal places are more opposed to becoming independent, and that it's interior and more newly settled communities that are more strongly in favor of Maine independence. And I do think there is some truth to that broad generalization, but I think perhaps quite a bit less than we might initially think. So what we see in this color-coded map are the 6 official votes on Maine separation, right? These are authorized by the Massachusetts legislature. You've got permission to take a vote of people in the District of Maine, and we'll see if they really want to separate from Massachusetts. Then we could go forward with some statehood. And one obvious thing to say is that this is sort of a stunner to most people who live in Maine in the 21st century, where we're pretty familiar with some hostility toward people who live in Massachusetts. We would think that if Mainers are given this choice, you would have, huge majorities in favor of becoming independent from the very start. But exactly the opposite is the case. And further, what this shows us, so here we have the county level votes color-coded. So green is opposed to Maine becoming an independent state, and purple is in favor of Maine becoming an independent state. And one of the basic observations here is to just look at that 1807 map. Every single county except for Kennebec County had a majority opposed to becoming independent. So this map of the vote by county, doesn't get a little bit more purple, a little bit more purple, a little bit more purple over time. It actually goes through some dramatic ups and downs that require a more complicated answer than just Well, of course, Mainers don't like people from Massachusetts, or of course, there's this internal external divide or coastal interior divide that's going to explain how this all happens. There's a lot more I can say about all of these votes and the strangeness of having two votes in 1816, but I am only going to turn to that if someone wants to ask a question about it. And I'm going to move on to take a little bit of a look at what is happening, not at the countywide level. So one of the things to point out is that these maps are really quite misleading. Right? We've already established that we don't even know where the northern border of the state is. So here we're using a sort of, image of Maine that we have in our minds that does not correspond to what Maine looked like or what its boundaries were in the statehood era. And in particular, does not represent where the people voting on the Maine statehood issue lived. And to see that, we're going to turn to my favorite map from the statehood era, again, made by Moses Greenleaf and accessible at the Osher Map Library and also at the special collections at the University of Maine. And what Greenleaf did in this terrific map is to add this color coding that shows us the pattern of settlement of English speakers in the state of Maine. So blue represents the places that were settled by English speakers by the time of the American Revolution. The pink represents expanded settlement of English speakers by the time of Jefferson's election in 1800. And then the yellow represents those areas that are settled by the time of Maine statehood in 1820. So we can see we've got Deer Isle there, kind of at the center of the map, right in the coast. And I want to take a little bit of a closer look at some Deer Isle voting data, right? What were voters in Deer Isle thinking about Maine separation? So here we've got a little close-up of the region we're talking about. Deer Isle, of course, is one of the oldest settled areas of down east Maine. And in the 6 votes, we have no data for 2 of these elections, but we can see quite clearly that Deer Isle is overwhelmingly opposed to Maine becoming an independent state. Right? And these 2 elections in 1816, you have not a single individual voting in favor of Maine statehood. That is quite remarkable. There are not many communities that are voting at that low a level. And that 1819 vote is also a real stunner. When we put that up, if you remember the 1819 map, every single county had a majority in favor of independence. It is true, Hancock County has the lowest majority, just 52% in favor of Maine independence in Hancock County in that July of 1819 vote. But Deer Isle is just off the charts in terms of its opposition to statehood, right? Statewide, 72% of voters favored statehood in 1819. And here, as late as 1819, we still got massive opposition to Maine independence in Deer Isle. Now, one reason that is often given for why things change so dramatically with that 1819 vote is a change in the federal coasting law. And this was a really important argument against Maine statehood in those 5 earlier elections, that because of federal law, Maine shippers would be subject to greater taxation by other states if they separated from Massachusetts. Now that law has been changed by the US Congress in 1818. It no longer applies. Other places acknowledge this and now are really on board in a big way for Maine independence. But Deer Isle is one that is sticking to its guns. It doesn't really care ultimately about that economic issue, right? Deer Isle is strongly commercially oriented in this period, but the change in the law does not really change voters' minds there in a very decisive way. All right, I think this is a good place for me to take a little break. I think I've been holding forth for just under an hour, and I probably have tried some of your patience, but I would love to get questions or comments. I can flip back and look at the slides and talk about them in some more detail. I've also got one other slide with some more local information about Deer Isle that I could turn to and talk about, but I'm going to take a sip of water and hope that someone is typing in a chat question or a Q&A question. All right, let's see. I need to move my screen. So James is signing off. Thanks a lot, James. I appreciate your help at the start of the talk, and I'm happy to have been able to share my sense of the statehood era. So Nina, I don't know if you want to check back in. Maybe you can twist some arms of people that you see in the audience to ask a question or offer.
Oh, I hopefully you can hear me right now. Can you?
Yes.
Okay, good. I do see that we still have a fair number of people watching. I'm not seeing that anybody is actually typing anything right now. It may be that you have answered all their questions.
I do. So I see James Albrecht is in the audience, who I know is an extraordinary local historian. I wonder if he's got a Deer Isle perspective that he might share with us.
The other thing that I will say, Liam, and to the audience, is that if you don't want to type, I can make it so that you could actually just talk and ask your questions if you prefer that. So if that's something that you would like to do, you can hopefully find a place where you can click to raise your hand, and then I can make it so that your audio will be available. You will not be joining by video, so you don't have to worry about that, if that's helpful to anyone. It does look like there's something in the chat, Liam. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh yeah, it just popped up. All right. So this is a question from the Deer Isle Sunset Church. Why did Deer Isle still oppose statehood? Well, that is a good question. And, you know, this is really something that I rely on members of a local historical society to help me figure out. You know, I did take a look at this really invaluable resource for understanding the statehood era. This is a compilation of meetings to discuss the statehood issue, and the bulk of it concerns the convention, the Constitutional Convention for the state in 1819. And so I looked up and found that the delegate to the state Constitutional Convention was Ignatius Haskell. And he unfortunately never speaks, at least not in the recorded minutes. So we don't really know his particular stand on issues. He did support the Constitution when it was drafted. There were some, not many, but there were some delegates, particularly from Hancock County, who did not sign the Constitution to note their support. He was not one of them, so he accepted the direction that the state was going by that time. So that would be, you know, one of the leads I would love to hear about. If someone knows anything about Ignatius Haskell through genealogical research or local historical society work, perhaps that would help us understand a bit more of what was going on in Deer Isle. Another way to get at that, not through individuals, is by trying to understand what sort of community was Deer Isle in 1820. And the census for that year has this interesting count of what segment of the economy male heads of household worked in. And so the three choices were agricultural, commercial, commerce, or manufacturing. And what I've got here are the percentages for Deer Isle, for Hancock County, and for the state of Maine of who falls into each of those categories. And so what's interesting, Maine is overwhelmingly an agricultural state. 80%, a little over 80% of Maine households fell into that agricultural category. Hancock County is a little bit below that state average, and Deer Isle is dramatically lower still. And that is essentially all replaced in Deer Isle with an emphasis on commerce, right? Fishing, commercial fishing, mercantile activity. So again, that really explains why Deer Isle residents earlier in the voting process were strongly opposed to becoming independent. But it doesn't really help us explain that 1819 vote, that law that would penalize people involved in commerce if Maine became independent had changed, yet Deer Isle residents still feel strongly they would like to stay part of Massachusetts. So I think that there's a hand raised in the participant area. So I think that's a request for a verbal question.
They should have the opportunity to ask their question now.
Okay, I'm Stratton Chiquette, and my grandmother did enormous amounts of research, and how Lady Temple got hold of all the islands in Penobscot Bay because of debt that Massachusetts owed her. Do you know about her?
So only in the most general sort of way, but it's really a fascinating, just the whole process of the complicated land claims and contested land claims throughout the settlement of Maine are fascinating. And so can you tell us more about it?
I have these books of stuff from my grandmother, but I didn't reread all of that stuff but before this talk. So maybe I should talk to you separately later.
That'd be great. And I at some point, I would really encourage you to think about sharing that material with the Deer Isle Historical Society or with the History Room at the Emerson Memorial Library. It sounds like really valuable material.
Yeah.
Well, Liam, I don't see any other hands up.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming and persevering on such a hot and humid day. It's really my pleasure. I wish I could have been there in person and had the advantage of getting to see Deer Isle and the whole peninsula down there, which I don't get to as often as I would like. So sadly for now, just via Zoom.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Riordan, for being willing to do this, and you should feel free to come down anytime you'd like. I'd love to show you the library. It's beautiful, and I can tell you all the great places to go.
That sounds fantastic. I'll take you up on that, Nina.
All right, so thank you for your time, and I just want to say also, Dr. Riordan, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I was so startled to hear that politics were more contentious 200 years ago. It's remarkable. You've just supplied so much interesting information about Maine state history, and I think all of us that were listening have learned a lot, and I'm grateful. And to all of you, thank you for joining us today. If you've enjoyed this presentation and wish you could share it with others, technology is on your side. Dr. Riordan has graciously given us permission to post the recording on our website for a limited time. I'll have the video up in a few days. It takes a little bit to get it ready, but people can access it from both the home page and the event page on our website at deerislelibrary.com. Library events from the comfort of your own home are how we can continue to offer you interesting speakers while limiting risk. And we have another Zoom webinar in 2 weeks. On August 26th at 4:30, Dr. Carla Gunther will be presenting Climate Change in the Gulf of Maine. You can visit our website for more information on that event and to access the link to the Zoom webinar. Chase Emerson Memorial Library relies upon charitable contributions from friends like you for almost 2/3 of our annual budget. Your cash gift is tax deductible to the extent allowed by law and goes directly to support our many services and programs. In an era where much is needed reinventing, we continue to look for ways to serve this community safely and well. Please, if you are able, consider donating to help us continue. You can visit our website at deerislelibrary.com and click the donate button or send a check to Chase Emerson Memorial Library, P.O. Box 9, Deer Isle, Maine, 04627. As always, I can be reached via email at deerislelibrary@gmail.com or by phone at 207-348-2899. Have a great evening, and I hope to see you in 2 weeks, if not sooner.
Thanks a lot, Nina.
Thank you, Dr. Riordan.
My pleasure.